So, dear friends, it is a pleasure to be here tonight in person in a wonderful city of Lviv in western Ukraine. And this city actually has hosted a lot of wonderful initiatives that are aimed at promoting, amplifying Ukraine's voice outside Ukraine. And we are today in the office of one of such initiatives with their wonderful head, Sasha Dovzhyk. So we welcome everyone who is present today with us here in the audience and who will be watching us online and on our podcasting platforms. So today it is Jonathan Fink, it is me, Yaroslava Buchta, and the Office of Index, Institute for Documentation and Exchange, and Sasha Dovzhyk, Ukrainian writer, curator, academic, who was a special projects curator for Ukrainian Institute in London, and whose voice has been heard by the New York Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, The Guardian, and many, many others. And we would perhaps like to start with Index.
Yeah, I think we've got a ton of questions about all sorts of topics, obviously the invasion, negotiations, and so on. But first of all, what is Index? We know that you sort of created this affiliate from scratch here, which is quite a daunting thing to do in wartime. Tell us about Index, its mission, its purpose, and its impact.
But first of all, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot that you've come to Ukraine, you've had quite an adventure at the border, and you're not coming empty-handed, you're coming with aid, and we do appreciate it here a lot, especially at this time when the outside realities might feel a bit grim. So Index, the Institute for Documentation and Exchange, was launched in Lviv in September 2024. So we are quite young. We are in the 5th month of our operations. The institution was created with the aim of pursuing epistemic justice for Ukraine through 2 strands of our activity. First of all, it's the documentation of wartime experiences as seen from Ukrainian standpoints. And this documentation can take various forms. It can be documentation through literature, photography, art, various formats, oral history, intellectual reflection, which help us to not only capture the moment and basically capture the knowledge of what is going on in Ukraine at this time, but also to preserve it and to pass it on not only to people like 5 years ahead of us, but we hope that this knowledge will survive and inform the ways in which the perception of this war is formed in the future. And our second strand of activity is intellectual exchange. So the documentation actually is rooted in this intellectual exchange because we know very well that it is only through this exchange of knowledge, of experiences with our colleagues, peers from abroad, that we can actually see ourselves reflected and also calibrate this vision of Ukrainians and our struggle, and also maybe offer some keys to solving global problems, because here in Ukraine we sometimes happen to be at the forefront of various processes that shape our reality worldwide, be it like misinformation, be it ecological problems, or, well, yes, genocidal invasions by neighboring dictatorships. So it helps to bring people from abroad to Ukraine and to put them in touch with their peers, their colleagues from Ukraine who are doing academic research, who are engaged in creative ways of capturing the wartime reality in our country. And we've been doing it through fellowships, through residencies. We invite academics, artists, creators, Scholars from Ukraine, like from cities like Kharkiv. Our current resident is a historian from Kharkiv, for example, and also their counterparts from other parts of Europe and the US so far. We hope to engage with other geographies as well, and we foster kind of fruitful environment for their interaction with each other. So we create events for them so that they can share their knowledge with the local communities, local public, but we also create internal research seminars so that new ways of creating knowledge emerge, like in this room where we are currently sitting. And so far the feedback has been very encouraging. We've seen new artworks which reflect on the war experiences in Ukraine emerge during these fellowships, during this short 3 months of residency. We've seen monographs on genocidal tropes of Holodomor era and their instrumentalization in the current war being finished here during these residencies. So I think so far it's been so good. We are happy with what we are witnessing, and as I mentioned, all these activities have this maybe far-fetched mission of actually ensuring epistemic justice for Ukraine. So not only justice that is created in courtrooms, through court hearings, and in jails where we ultimately want all the abusers and violators of international law to end up, but also the kinds of justice that unfold on film screens, on international platforms like book festivals and film festivals, and in museums. So the justice of how this war and our country and our experience is being seen.
I actually will follow up on the epistemic justice that you mentioned. So this term comes up quite often, and maybe you could explain a little bit more what it actually means, why we're talking about this so much in conversations about Ukraine's agency, because we had in one of our first episodes Johanna Kutishova, who was one of your fellows, and this term also came up quite a few times. So it was in relation to journalism, but I think that it has a way broader meaning. So if you could talk a little bit more about that and explain what it means and why it is important.
Absolutely. I'm very glad that Johanna has been one of your guests, and it was a pleasure having her as our fellow as well. So epistemic injustice is a term which was helpfully coined by Filmmakers, and it applies to situations, to the dynamics of knowledge production, where the ability of one group in interpreting their situation, describing it and reflecting on it is doubted just because of this group's identity. Miranda Fricker's famous example is a black person being mistrusted, that they're being mistreated by police because they're black. And the power dynamics in the US context is such that the police is more likely to be trusted. In the context of Ukraine, the epistemic injustice, the most stark example is probably the fact that at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainians were not trusted with their knowledge, that their knowledge and their understanding of their position, their situation is valid. Mm-hmm. So you know very well, and we've discussed it a million times, that I don't want to generalize, but many Western experts and think tanks believe that Ukraine would fall in 72 hours. But Ukrainians themselves were screaming in all the loudspeakers they could reach that, no, actually, we will resist. And we have knowledge of how to fight this war because we've been doing it for 8 years. But they were mistrusted because they're Ukrainians and that they have not gained this authority, this credibility in the Western eyes. And we basically want to change this. We want Ukrainian knowledge and self-perception to be treated as authoritative and credible.
Yeah, and this is actually discussed as part of the conversation about decolonization very often. And from my feeling as Ukrainian, this conversation has only recently entered our public spaces on the level of how we decolonize ourselves. But this conversation is nothing new for the Western universities. It's been on in the context of many other countries. So I was wondering to what extent Ukrainian context actually resemble the experience of other colonized nations, to what extent it is different, and maybe what Ukrainian context can contribute into this discussion.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind, I'll just dwell a little bit on the Western universities and how this whole situation of not actually seeing Russia as an empire has been witnessed by myself. So between 2016 and 2020, I was teaching London undergraduates English literature and comparative literature. And we had a textbook example of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which we treated as this foundational core text of Western culture. And we applied all sorts of methodologies to it to see how they would work, queer theory, feminism, Marxism, and eventually, inevitably, post-colonial theory. And we were pumped on Said and Gayatri Chakravorty's Spivak. It was in the air, and we could dissect any text and see the tropes of Orientalism and imperialism and how these tropes work in these texts. And that was jolly, but then I gave my students an excerpt in which Mary Shelley describes Victor's journey through the Russian north. And they read it and they saw absolutely nothing wrong with it. And they didn't pick any tropes of exoticization, any tropes of imperialism and colonialism in that little excerpt. And the very idea that Russia was an empire was absolutely alien to them. So, this is a little example of how it usually works out in the Western university classrooms. But I think it shows us a lot in how Russian imperial myth has been functioning in these classrooms for a very long time, shaping outlooks, framing the ways knowledge is perceived and produced. Mm-hmm.
And that's persistent. I mean, that takes time to shift those. Is it a generational change? Because if you have an academic who maybe has been writing books for 20 years, formed ideas which has created their reputation and their status, if that suddenly falls apart, if they accept one part of the narrative, then everything has to be questioned. So is that your perception, that some people are open to that, some people are very resistant to their life's work being challenged and the ideas that inform it?
Such a good point, exactly. If you've built your entire career, if your life's work is connected to the myth of the great Russian culture, and we've seen a lot of that, it's quite difficult to change when you're in your 50s, 60s and so on. So all the professorial seats are being currently okay, I'm not generalizing, not all professorial seats, but many professorial seats in Western Academy are currently occupied by people who have not seen a problem with Russian imperialism. They see the Russian culture as these dachas and dissidents and samovars and samizdats and everyone is a dissident and so on and so forth. And the fact that it's just such a negligibly small proportion of the Russian population and the Russian culture has been escaping their knowledge for generations, and this pattern of thought is very difficult to currently shift. So I just can nod in agreement with you, Jonathan.
And do you think it is worth sort of making parallels when it comes to discussion of Ukrainian context, also in the context of genocide, for example? Because something that I faced was that when I was trying to explain the Holodomor or anything else, as a journalist, I was asked by the editors to make parallels with explain this on the examples that are familiar to Europeans. And we know a lot of parallels coming with other wars happening around the world, again with Ukraine. So I was wondering if it's actually helpful to make these sort of parallels when you are talking about these things, or would it be sort of more efficient to keep boundaries of these cases and just discuss each one separately? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
As I have been teaching comparative literature, I think comparisons can actually be helpful to an extent, and it's very important not to overstep certain boundaries and not to stop comparing and competing in our traumas and who has been like the most genocided nation and so on and so forth. So this competition is not the one that we should be willing to take part in. But yes, trying to build our argument on comparisons is quite helpful. Like, going back to the case of seeing Russia as an empire, yes, we have been taught a lot about Natasha Rostova and her balls, but the fact that Russia is actually a republic actually consists of 21 republics, and the largest of those 21 republics is the size of India or even bigger. This knowledge is somehow not registered, and I think it is much more important for us than the fact that, Lev Tolstoy had like some interesting ideas back in the 19th century. So these kind of comparisons, not only historical, not only between communities, but actually like showing people the map, could do wonders, I think.
Well, the beautiful soul of Mr. Dostoevsky, of course, which, you know. That's going to be leading into my question here. So I'm getting my head around the epistemic, so tackling knowledge, tackling either the deliberate or accidental corruption of knowledge, or in all its forms, information, artifacts of culture. But there is also a concerted effort. I mean, there's entrenched interests, all these things, but there's also a concerted effort to weaponize Russian culture. There's a concerted effort to insert narratives into a whole variety of media. So how do you tackle that? Because it's an ongoing active process. I would imagine the response to that needs to be pretty robust. You almost need a reverse weaponization to match that sort of cadence and investment that we see coming from the Russian side.
A very good question, but also a difficult one, because we don't have the resources available to Russia to sort of boost our culture in a similar way. The one thing that we should remember, and that Ukrainians are currently very successful in pursuing, is actually tracking the links of Russian capital in Western cultural institutions. Not links, but roots, and we know that these roots go deep. The Ukrainian Institute, the state one affiliated with the Foreign Affairs Ministry, has done a wonderful research on how Russian capital is actually funding Western cultural institutions that seem so harmless. But then you like dig one layer deeper and you realize that like this opera or this funky little NGO have been actually funded by Gazprom, and the cultural production that emerges from them has a certain political gravitas, right?
Film as well. We had The Russians at War, which is just a much more blatant example of it.
Exactly. We have been having these conversations how we can counter that, and the obvious answer is to produce our own films that can compete, which is obviously quite difficult to do during wartime. So yes, we do rely here on support of our allies who see the value of not only military aid but also of culture. Culture as a means of achieving security. I think it is right that.
And it's also probably hard because when we talk about Russian narrative, it has this complexity because it's been something familiar, something people are used to. And then when you come with this strange Ukrainian thing that emerged after the full-scale war started, and like, what is this? So basically it also, so we talk about decolonization and we say that in order to decolonize, Russia needs to question its basically grounds on which it stands and its ideas on like who we are, what they are in the world and so on and so on. But so does everyone else basically handling with the issue, because if you are, for example, the representative of some Western community again, and for all your life you've believed that this is the way things are, so Russia is good, or like this is like great Russian culture or ballet, and then suddenly somebody comes up, especially Ukrainian, and then be like, oh, it's actually not that easy. And then you sort of, again, coming back to the epistemic injustice, on the one hand, you have it as an issue, but on the other hand, we quite masterfully instrumentalize it for our purpose, as in like also helps to get allies and then promote our ideas through other people. So I feel like it's kind of a complex question if you look at it from different angles.
Yes, I think another interesting and helpful concept here is the one coined by Olesa Chromeychuk, and I always like remind of this wonderful article of hers, "Where is Ukraine?" And in it she speaks about the absence of Ukraine on the mental map of Europe, of the world, because this mental map has been occupied by Russia, by Russian capital and by Russian culture, which more often than not are the same thing. And we need to draw the contours of Ukraine on that map, and those contours are the borders of 1991, obviously. So this is the big task now.
Yeah, but then it sort of needs to enter like intimate spaces, because again, when you talk about that on political level or like on media, okay, that's good. We read media for like 10 minutes a day, we switch it off and we go live our lives. So how do we introduce Ukraine? Or basically this is the same conversation for anyone else living under the war context. So how do we introduce that into everyday lives of people who have never heard a single explosion in their lives, say, for example, or air raid alert, or something that strikes me is whenever we go to Blackwell's, for example, or like some other bookshop, there is a huge pile of Russian literature always available. But then if you go into Ukrainian literature section, it's basically, at best, it's Kurkov, who is translated, because, I mean, he writes in Russian and then it's easier to translate him. But something that I'm wondering all the time about is, okay, where are we? So where is Ukrainian literature? So there was this kind of like spike, and then like we're down again.
When did you register the spike?
I mean, I feel like I've seen a couple of more books with like Ukrainer being present there, but then suddenly there is nothing sort of again. At least the first, like 2022.
Early 23, and then I noticed that in my local bookshop. It grows and then it shrinks a little bit.
Okay, they sold all the 20 copies, right, that they bought. And
those are all gone.
What do you think would be actually the way of bringing knowledge about Ukraine into more like everyday lives of the people? And I think it's actually, again, as I said, it's relevant for basically any nation that is going through war.
Yeah. Since we're speaking in English to an international audience, I will be probably speaking about what people outside of Ukraine can do to support this effort. So, like, while Ukrainians live in this context of constant institutional erasure, like we try to establish an institution, a colonial empire comes and wipes it all out. There are traditions of knowledge and centers of knowledge that are well resourced and well established in our ally countries, right? And they do have the resources to invest, say, in translation of Ukrainian literature, and it has to be done these days. It's not that there is no literature that's worth attention, it's that it's not being resourced properly, and the translations have not reached international markets and international readerships. This work is currently being done by Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. They are turning up these volumes of Ukrainian classics in translation, and but they're just like one institution among many who could be doing this work, right? It's not like enough to sell or to buy one Ukrainian author's rights and be happy with yourself that you've done your great Ukrainian coverage and your series does not need any more from Ukrainian authors. So we need to encourage that kind of interest and to put Ukrainian books on the shelves in our allied countries' bookshops. I'm hesitating to say Western because obviously this is not what I mean.
Japan as well. It would be great to have it in other languages where they're supportive of Ukraine. Korea, South Korea.
Absolutely.
Taiwan, there's one of the people who we interviewed last time, where we were in Lviv, is a gallery owner, and she's out in Taiwan talking about Ukrainian art and making the comparisons because yes, both have rather vicious empires, colonial empires on their doorstep with designs on their territory, and I think it's an interesting commonality.
And there has been quite an expansion of interest among Ukrainian cultural producers in the African continent, and there are new solidarities that are being built between Ukrainians and South Africans, for example. I've been hearing again and again from colleagues who have been invited to festivals there that there is this innate understanding of the struggle, and so we have to explore and expand these networks of solidarity.
We'll come back to that, because one of the problems, isn't it, in the global south and certainly parts of Africa, is they do not see Russia as a colonial entity. We'll come back to that, because the question I was going to ask about, where we're at politically at the moment, the options that might be forced on Ukraine to negotiate or capitulate, and we know that's what Moscow's going to be forcing. But I'm going to rephrase it slightly. How important is it, this cultural sphere, this idea of changing perception of Ukraine as a unique identity, as opposed to bratski narod, brotherly peoples, etc., because that actually impinges on the political question. If actually they're countries with the same roots and this commonality as propaganda would have us believe, then there's maybe not that much difference between negotiation and capitulation. They're far closer mentally and politically. But if you accept Ukraine as a distinct identity, culture, and history, then this question of these two becomes there's more clarity about why one's partially acceptable and the other's completely should be off the table. No capitulation.
And if we accept the credibility of Ukrainian knowledge, we are also taking some issues off the table, right? I feel like I'm a depository of ancient historical knowledge here, because I remember 2015 when we were forced to negotiate with Russia. For those who are not as ancient as I am in my mid-30s, but doesn't remember, in 2014... I believe that you remember, Jonathan. I have hope and faith. So in 2013, Ukraine was forced into a series of awful negotiations with Russian proxies, which we remember as Minsk agreements. The first Minsk was after the defeat of Ukrainian forces in Ilovaisk by regular Russian army. And the second was after the encirclement and defeat of Ukrainian forces in Debaltseve around this time in 2015, again by the regular Russian forces. And in this situation, under duress, Ukraine was forced by our European allies, France and Germany, so they sanctified this kind of peace agreement, to sign a piece of paper which basically legitimized the violation of international law, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the seizure of territory, and so on and so forth. As a result, we entered the era of these false ceasefires, during which countless Ukrainian lives were lost on the battlefield, including the life of the brother of my close friend. So the war didn't stop, and we know that Russia violates these ceasefire agreements every time. I'm missing
There's Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and of course we're at risk of Minsk 3 if we go down the same route. All failed.
The negotiations about what and with whom, and what kind of impunity will we perpetrate by this new round of negotiations with people who have proved countless times that they are not ones to be trusted, right? And if they were not punished for the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and 15, there were no sanctions, there was no duress on Russia as on Ukraine to sign this piece of paper. Russia did not enter into any kind of economic difficulty, Nord Stream 2 flourished, they built up their stockpile of weapons and invaded Ukraine full scale in 2022.
Nord Stream 1 and 2 carried on, of course, yeah.
What are we looking at now if we again allow ourselves to think that we can negotiate some kind of ceasefire, some kind of peace deal with Russia? that they will again be like encouraged to stockpile weapons and to reinvade Ukraine. I'm not sure, like in 6 or 16 or 36 months, we will be able to resist the way we have resisted in 2022. And obviously the impunity of Russia, which again has been emboldened and encouraged in all its savagery, encourages dictators worldwide, and we've seen it already.
And for those who are naive and listening, it's now on record the architect of Putin's hybrid regime, the architect of the little green men in the invasion of Crimea, Vladislav Surkov, he's now on record as saying that Minsk was a diversion. Mm-hmm. It was always intended as a way of pausing the war so that Ukraine could be weakened. It hasn't worked out that way, but it's on record that Russia was never interested in peace. Mm-hmm. And I think we can presume they're not interested at this point. I mean, do you think that is a fair conclusion?
Like, let's wait for the next air raid alert and test this theory if they're interested in peace or in something else. Obviously, they were not interested in peace in 2015, and they are not interested in peace now. They are not interested in the existence of sovereign Ukraine on their borders. They're interested in rebuilding their empire, which they do not envision without Ukraine. It's either Ukraine destroyed or Ukraine as an appendage to Russia. Which obviously doesn't fly well with Ukrainians.
Actually, on our way here, we passed Auschwitz, and we specifically made effort to go to that place. And I remember that we were talking that one of the quotes that sort of like starts the exposition is that we can't forget it, because it will come back and it will basically happen again. And do you think that sort of forgetfulness about, again, peace negotiations, about events in the past, again, like other genocides that happened within the same context, is actually an issue? And if so, what can be done about that?
I was in Warsaw in December, and I went to the Museum of Polish Jews, Polin, and there they tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the story of the Ringelblum archive, which emerged in this ghetto. So while the Jews in the ghetto were massacred by the Nazis, some among them thought that keeping the record of what was happening to them, of their daily lives, through photographs, diaries, the records of their dreams, was valuable for future generations. That this was a source of knowledge about pure evil, and also the source of knowledge about resistance to this pure evil. And unlike the people who created the archive, it survived, the record survived, and this is how we know not only the story of the Nazis, but also the story of those who were their victims. So we just like keep doing it. We keep creating this record in hope that it will be of service to humanity, and we record our experiences in various forms and formats, and basically put this record in a bottle and send it in the sea, and hope that on the other end someone will find the bottle, read the message, and think that, okay, this was insane, let's try not to do it again.
And you mentioned earlier this idea of Russian narratives, sucking the oxygen out of the room. You mentioned Tolstoy and whatever merits there are. Certainly the attention that Russian writers are given doesn't come from pure organic greatness. There's great investment, financial investment in amplifying that greatness, in a way that most Western cultures, we have soft power, but we don't go around the world pumping tens of millions of pounds into promoting Dickens around the world. Well, okay, there's a little bit of money there.
British Council are actually
doing they are doing it. Okay. It's definitely stand corrected on that one. But this idea is interesting, because I don't want to have the sort of, the debate that certainly we talked about and has been debated widely about platforming Russians. But I think even for those who are being introduced to Ukrainian culture and narratives, this idea that the greatness of the Russian canon and the appropriation of other nationalities and other creative works like Mikhail Hochul, for instance, I probably haven't pronounced that correctly, but
Holodomor?
No, Hochul.
Hochul.
Need to work on that, definitely. But the investment in that means that you have this body of work, and it not only diminishes the oxygen and the attention for, say, Ukrainian writers, there's also a process of eradication of other literatures so that this canon can be formed and then promoted. And other Russian writers are also excluded from the canon and, consigned to oblivion as well. How do you reverse that? Because that's a really tough one, given the investment, given the aura of greatness there. But the idea that one culture takes the oxygen, and in order to survive, it has to eradicate others. This idea of literary genocide, I think, is quite new to most people and shocking.
Right. So, not to give more room to Russian writers and Russian culture again, I think we should mention something that you have touched upon, which is epistemic violence being perpetrated by Russians in relation to Ukrainians and other colonized nations. And we don't, it's quite obvious, we don't have to theorize about it. Index, for example, is contributing to the monitoring of the figures of Ukrainian culture who have been killed since the start of the full-scale invasion. And it's dozens and dozens and dozens of names. And every time that we are asked where is your Pushkin, where is your Dostoevsky, and where is your Tolstoy, we can actually point to this list and say, well, they've been killed. And this kind of violence has been perpetrated for centuries by Russians in relation to their colonized nations. So telling these stories of not only people who create and who keep creating against the odds, even now, but also telling the stories of people who are not contributing to this culture anymore for the reason that they have been murdered, is very important, and it's one of our missions, actually. And by doing this, we sort of it's not a way to fill the void, it's impossible, but at least it's a way of retracing the contours of that loss, and to say that, okay, this is a big hole in the canvas of Ukrainian culture that will never be filled. Something should have been in its place, it will never be filled, but let's witness this and let's sit with this knowledge and think about what we can do in order not to repeat this again and to stop what is going on now, the genocide.
And rather than, producing the 5 billionth production of The Cherry Orchard, maybe Kobyliesi Ukrainka or some other choice of...
That wouldn't be bad at all. It's true. Victoria Melina's book will be published in February. Victoria Melina is a Ukrainian writer who was killed in a missile attack on Kramatorsk in 2023. And she was writing a book about, it's called Looking at Women, Looking at War, about women who document Russian war crimes. It was left unfinished at the time of her death, and an editorial group of which I was honored to be part, assembled it from fragments. And in February 2025, it will be published and it will be out, hopefully in your local bookshop and in international bookshop chains. And I encourage everyone picking that book instead of Cherry Orchard.
But this is also another thing, that it's not just a big hole in Ukrainian culture, but it's something that the world is losing. It's, I think that this is the understanding that is often lacking, that it's okay, this is Ukraine and this is your issue. If, if they get killed, okay, fine. It's it's your loss. It doesn't have anything to do with us. But I think that probably something quite important is also to sort of cross this line and this bubble of, okay, this is you, this is us, but actually promote this understanding. There's no, it's actually you as well who are losing from this.
Exactly. It's my hobby horse talking about Lesa Ukrainka, but she is actually one of the writers who could and should have been read widely during her lifetime, because she touched upon some universal issues that would have enlightened and illuminated people not only in Ukraine but globally. She looked at some European motifs and tropes through a feminist and an anti-colonial perspective, and her oeuvre should have enriched this shelf in this classics, golden classics shelf in any bookshop in any European capital, small town. But she wasn't there because she was silenced during her lifetime, and she was silenced during the Soviet period, and it's only now that Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute is actually producing new and fresh translations of her work, which I hope we will be reading now, finally, in the English language. So yes, keep an eye on Ukrainian books that will be emerging in the nearest future. There is quite a lineup.
And I'm going to ask about, so we talked about genocide in all its different forms and erasure, but it also strikes me, to broaden this out to things like social media, the use of memes, the use of highly emotive and politically partisan narratives. There's an attempt or an experiment going on to reshape reality. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that actually it's far more effective than people give it credit for. With a meme or a phrase, you can wipe out whole territories, countries, you can wipe out whole portions of history, mm-hmm. or create an alternative narrative that sort of blunts the impact of that. That's not necessarily new, though. Even before social media, it seems to me Russia has made attempts to not just rewrite history, but erase any evidence that would tell an alternative narrative. So what's your view on that, and how do you see that playing out in real time at the moment?
Mm-hmm. I think this is why we are here for, to produce like embodied, nuanced knowledge that is situated in time and in place, and that nobody can take away from you. Maybe it's a bit of a grim example, but I will go back deep into the index history of 4 months ago. So when we invited our first cohort of fellows in September 2024, they arrived on the night of a missile attack on Lviv. And they heard the sirens and they heard the explosions. And in a couple of days, they actually visited the funeral of a family that was killed in that attack. And it was a profound experience, and it's something that you cannot actually experience while just reading social media. And then they were introduced to local cultural producers, and so how they reflected on the situation. And then they were introduced to local displaced people from Mariupol in a local NGO, and they talked to them and they engaged with their archive. And then they were taken to a prosthetic workshop in an Unbroken center which works with rehabilitation of servicemen and servicewomen who were wounded in the war, of civilians and so on. And these kind of engagement and this in-person, offline conversations are something that reshapes the way you engage with this reality. It actually becomes real for you. And someone else's pain becomes something you take personally. It's not something on your Instagram feed, a blurred image that you can just disengage from with like one movement of your finger. So I understand that it's not for. We should resist by trying to create this embodied knowledge, and we should resist by trying to create this situated knowledge, and by creating in-person connections that can later develop into networks of solidarity and into projects that will thrive maybe not in five days but in 5 years or 15 years.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about that and creation of these networks, I'd like to return a little bit to the previous question of contextualization of knowledge of Ukraine within the world history. Mm-hmm. So where are we now with that? And how is Ukraine sort of maybe looking in the context of other wars and other war contexts? So how is it similar, how is it different, and what can we each teach each other?
Mm-hmm. I'm not a historian, so it's difficult for me to say what kind of battle is going on in the history department in the academy. But I think that one very promising strand of research in Ukrainian history is the history of Crimean Tatars and the history of indigenous communities in Ukraine. And it's also something that immediately speaks to similar research outside of Ukraine, and people who do research on settler colonialism, for example, in the Canadian or American context, suddenly see that Russia also was a settler colonial empire, and what they did in Crimea in the 19th century is like the textbook example of that, right? And this helps to draw the parallels we have been talking about before. So this kind of research is very promising and encouraging for me.
And returning to these personal stories, so some feedback that I get quite often from people around me, saying younger generation, is that there is just so much about wars, and they call it war fatigue, but whatever that means. But there's just so much about wars that we sort of, what do we do? How do we help? And we just want to live our lives, and we can't just be engaging in that because we anyways can't do anything, and so on and so on and so on. So I guess my question is where is the boundary between telling this story and then telling it in a way that it actually reaches the audience, rather than simply makes them sort of shut down and be okay, I'm not just following this because this is too much, this is too cruel, whatever reason they come up with. But so where's the line between the two?
Right. So my first point would be that you can't experience war fatigue if you're not in a war. What you experience is social media fatigue. I don't know, touch grass, look at the sky, walk with your dog, talk to your therapist, but don't come back with it to a Ukrainian who actually lives through a war, right? Or to a Palestinian, or you name it. This is not war fatigue. War fatigue is something experienced by people in the trenches currently in Lebanon, right? And how not to overwhelm people and not to make them feel helpless is also not a question for myself. But I would probably just quote Alexandra Matvichuk, who always the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, obviously human rights defender, who always insists that we are never actually helpless, that we might feel so as individuals because we are empathetic human beings and we see pain and we want to fix it instantly, and maybe our individual actions will not solve world crises. But if we do something that is in our power and keep doing it and find other people with whom to do it and to pursue some cause of justice, we can actually have a chance at changing the world. Ukrainians have done it a couple of times through a couple of successful revolutions. And during these times, it felt like the world felt very dark, and we might have felt very helpless, but we just kept doing what we felt was right. And if you think that you can disengage from a problem and it will not come back to haunt you, sorry, Yaroslava, I'm talking to you as if you're an imaginary person who has this problem with their social media, which you obviously are not. So if you just disengage and think that this problem will not come back to haunt you, just let's have a look at the American elections. Let's have a look at the point where we have arrived currently, right? And if we think that the war in Ukraine will not expand beyond the borders of Ukraine if we just shut down our phones and do nothing, This is wrong. Putin and his allies have countless times said that Ukraine is not the ultimate goal. They have goals in Europe, and I don't think that if the impunity they have enjoyed so far, they continue to enjoy, this problem will not come to haunt our allies or disengaged citizens worldwide.
So I want to get back to, and we've talked about social media, we've talked about agency, and of course, a lot of the interviews on the channel are about methodologies for fighting disinformation. And of course, some people have technical solutions. You're focusing, I would say, on the quality of information and products from information, which can be sort of consumed in a multi-layered way. But it strikes me that Russia didn't invent the problem of informational decline. So it seems that as information gets exponentially more substantial in volume, it was believed when the internet came along that actually there'd be an equivalent qualitative increase at the same time. But quite the reverse has taken place. It's like now, like finding a needle in a haystack. There's almost an inverse ratio between quantity of information and the actual, let's say, truth that can be found in that information. Similarly, it was thought that with the accessibility the internet gives, you would have less partisanship. What we're getting is more. So the question here is, to counter this, we're not going to be able to prevent the exponential growth of information. So how do we make sure that we build sort of systems and processes that people can actually sort of tap into the quality information, find the little gold seam amongst this sort of massive detritus, as it were, that's being generated? And does it have to be rooted in experience and community and actually a culture that's self-questioning and evolving, like Ukrainian culture is emerging from the Soviet Union?
Yeah, thank you. It's a complex question. I wonder if you have an answer. But obviously my way of dealing with this problem is to encourage the creation of this embodied knowledge that we have been talking about. It's not only Index that is doing this kind of work in Ukraine, but I'm sure these are processes that are unfolding internationally. Our great partners and friends, PEN Ukraine, the human rights and literary organizations, are constantly bringing in people from abroad on these fieldwork trips and volunteer trips to not only like Kyiv or Kyiv region, but sometimes to frontline regions, to libraries somewhere in the east or south of Ukraine, where they can engage with local community and local readerships, and also bring them some aid. And once you have these in-person conversations and see it with your own eyes, I think that no amount of information that you consume online can shift this kind of knowledge that is very much situated in place and in personal connections to communities here on the ground.
I think this is something that we also get a lot in our interviews with journalists, because they're like, I came up with a couple of questions of like, what stories do you think will be remembered after the victory? And what they asked me, like, okay, you are very optimistic about whatever's going to happen first, and second, what they do, they basically try to archive everything they do, so something gets published, but a lot of their work is actually dedicating to documenting rather than informing public. So they document a lot in relation to war, a lot of personal stories, and they try to keep it also somewhere in the countries that are not affected by war. And in general, the aim that they talk about is, okay, how do we preserve ourselves so that Russia doesn't take away or take over this narrative again? Because I think that the comparison that comes to my mind is like, again, 1930s, and our Renaissance has been shot, and you basically have a huge gap, knowledge gap that emerged there, because a lot of things were erased, including like the destruction of musical instruments up until that in many, many different spheres, so that you can't actually recreate this knowledge or these items or this specific part of what our culture was. And yeah, and again, like what now Ukrainians are doing is like, okay, Ukrainian journalists specifically, it's okay, even if we still will have this sort of like safety kind of set of knowledge that will be kept somewhere else, so that like we will be able to recreate ourselves and like fill in these gaps.
I like this idea, and I think it's one of the ways of resistance, absolutely. Maybe I'll tell one story about resistance in a situation that feels very dire. Recently there was an exhibition, Unseen Force, about resistance in occupation. And there I saw something that absolutely like shook me. It was Vyshyvankas, and it was a collection of Vyshyvankas from Kherson, from a local museum, which a local museum keeper, the director of this museum, was collecting. Like she has had this huge, rich collection of embroidered shirts, embroidered Ukrainian shirts, and towels and so on. When the Russians came, they occupied the museum, and when the Ukrainian forces liberated it, she went inside and she saw that there were some textiles on the floor, and she started washing it and saw that it was actually the embroidered shirt, another embroidered shirt, and while she was washing them, they started soaking blood, and she understood that Russians were wiping like wounds of the tortured people in this particular museum with these Vyshyvanka shirts, these embroidered shirts. And these like Vyshyvankas that she washed and ironed and brought back to the museums, they are the kind of knowledge, they are the kind of artifacts that will be telling stories for generations, hopefully. That's not the end of the story. Russians blew up the Kakhovka Dam, and Kherson was obviously flooded, including that particular museum. And those Vyshyvankas were again soaked in dirt. And she went back and she found them and she washed them and she ironed them, and now they are traveling around Ukraine and they're displayed in this case among other artifacts of resistance in occupation. And I think that it is artifacts like this that are like living history of this war and of our resilience that will be telling our story. It's not about the rich Ukrainian folk traditions anymore. It's about the brutality of Russian genocide, but also resistance of people who have so far survived it.
I've got one short question, and then if you've got one, that's great, and then we'll go around and do a little Q&A around the room. And this comes back again to conversations we've had, I think, rather than in front of a camera, more in the pub probably. But it's about information. I know, obviously, most Ukrainians will understand Russian and be able to listen to some of the Russian sources, diaspora media and so on. And not all of it is absolutely dire. There is some useful and some accurate information out there.
I trust you here. I don't listen to it.
No,
okay.
Of course, I don't expect you to listen to it. But there is some information which, if you have a critical mindset, it's not that difficult as a Russian speaker to find out some of the reality of what's going on and what's being done in their name. It's certainly not impossible. But something I've come to realize is, and I think this is the Western perception, is if only Russians had the right information, then this wouldn't be going on. It would all be fundamentally different. And that raises the question of whether information alone is enough, or whether you need much more to preserve democracy. You need, activism, you need active knowledge, you need to be able to take information, piece it together in a more strategic way, and then do something with it. Yeah. It's not enough to just be a passive consumer.
Institutions.
And individual agency. So what's your feeling about
yes,
sort of that? Yes.
My feeling is yes. You need to have agency, and you need to have basically some courage to fight for your rights, which we haven't seen in the Russian context so far during the past 3 decades at least.
And that's not something that will change quickly. It's a multi-generational change.
I think we will be just swamped in these narratives of like Western journalists going to Moscow and speaking to Babushka Tanya near the metro, and she will be telling about her son Vanya who lost like 2 legs in Ukraine, but like he's so poor and she's so poor, so the poor journalist just like embraces these poor Russians who just are so clueless. he went to war and he probably killed people, right? And he probably knew what he was doing while he was doing it. He was not fighting like for his home, so he was invading a foreign country. So I would basically resist the idea that Russians do genocide because they are clueless and uninformed. They know what they are doing and they should be brought to some kind of accountability for their actions.
Well, I actually have a question which comes from more of like my personal background, and it's also a little bit related to, again, accountability. So I'm doing anthropology, and anthropology, it's, when I talk about that, people are like, what is that? So we start with actually explanation that this is about people and people's relation to each other. And then not that many people know that anthropology in Ukraine actually is almost non-existent. There is no single educational department where you can learn anthropology because it was basically eradicated in the same way as Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian culture in the 1930s. And this is the discipline that is actually aimed at showing these artifacts, these histories, these differences between different cultural groups. So there was a very very clear purpose of destroying anthropologists in the same way as destroying Ukrainian cultural representatives. So I guess my question is what is going on about this discipline? What can be done about returning this discipline? And if you also see that this is something that is missing probably from our social sciences research or research happening for international organizations, or just in general understanding who Ukrainians are and what is going on here.
I think this is true not only for anthropology, but for a number of academic disciplines, and basically for Ukrainian academia, which was so underfunded and neglected even after Ukraine got its independence in 1991. So basically now this field needs resources, and not only financial resources, but also intellectual resources. And I think it would be what is happening now with so many Ukrainians being forced to flee their country because of the war, who end up in knowledge production centers abroad. I think that at some point, if they choose and if they have an opportunity to return to Ukraine and bring back this knowledge, it will be very valuable for us and we can build on it. But there are gaps everywhere. There is a lot of work to be done. So and there is a lack of human resources as well as financial resources. So we encourage those who feel their age to come and plug in, because there are just too many areas where we currently need help. Yeah. Thank you.
Before going to Q&A, I wanted to thank Dr. Sasha Dovzhyk for, again, always fantastic insights and erudition and eloquence and passion and everything. And it's a great privilege to be able to do this in the city of Lviv here in Ukraine, which is under attack. Very poignant. So thank you from the audience, thank you from the channel. We'll take a few questions. Those questions, the answer to those questions will be available as an extra on the channel and, of course, as shorts as well. So thank you, everyone, for really joining us on this one. And do check out the Q&As. Right, let's do the Q&A.
Thank you so much for speaking to me and for inviting me to speak to you. It was great.
Thank you for hosting us here and for finding time for us.
It's great. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Well, let's do the Q&As because we'll edit them up and put them out. So, first of all, Jonathan Pierce, please.
Hello. I think a little bit convoluted and hopefully a two-part sort of question here that's okay. As we are involved in epistemic crisis globally, internationally, nationally, in a single domain, I find it fascinating that you were talking about in the academic domain, people outside of Russia not having a proper sense of what it is, and I'm wondering whether there's agency, there's manipulation, or it's just simply if I wanted to do Nordic studies, I would be really pro, Scandinavian countries and whatnot, and so I then be looking for the most positive aspects of what I'm learning. So there might be that element, but it could be that the Nordic states are really wanting to send out this sense of who they are in a really positive light, in a way that you say, you know, if you're going to Japan the world and they've got a false sense of what Russia is, that's probably going to be coming from people in those faculties going to Russia, Moscow State University, and getting a sense of what Russia is, Russia itself. So there's this really interesting dynamic there in the academic world, where we on the outside of Russia don't know who Russia is academically. But I wonder if a lot of this is because Russia doesn't know who they are either, because with the history of Germany, there's a term, if I butcher this, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is, broadly speaking, the struggle of overcoming the past and the work of coping with the past. So Germany has gone through this reckoning as therapy, almost public, collective of understanding who they are and what they had done through the Nazi Germany period. And Russia hasn't done that. So they've never got to grips with the horrors of their past and their colonial past and their imperial past. So that they just don't understand who they are yet, because they've not had that process. So how can academics and how can Russia come to terms with who they are, and what can you as Ukraine or us or international community do to help Russia to win the war, but come to help Russia through this process of self-awareness?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question. I think it brings us back to the issue of impunity, right? Because Germans did not do the reckoning out of the goodness of their hearts. They lost in a war, and they were forced into this process of reckoning by this loss. So the best thing that can actually happen to Russia and to Russians is a defeat, is a military defeat. And that will force them into some self-reflection, right? They will have to do some soul-searching after that. But if they're successful in Ukraine, let's imagine that they're successful in Ukraine, there will never come this moment of reckoning for them. So what can we do to help Russians realize who they are, bring them into the point of military defeat in Ukraine, which I'm sure will start all other kinds of processes in the Russian society. Yeah, I think that's basically it.
And then in terms of not understanding who Russia is from outside of Russia, and also inside, I don't think understand who Ukraine, or we are beginning to understand as the international community, the war, the silver lining of the war is that Ukrainian identity has been thrown into the world in a way that is really positive for Ukraine. And that's an interesting dynamic. But I'm wondering what, you were talking in terms of maybe high culture and academia, but you've talked in terms of disinformation and misinformation on social media. We've got the spectrum from social media through popular culture to high culture, maybe. What can Ukraine do to thrust itself into the international stage? I mean, I think things like the Eurovision Song Contest are really positive. You've got films that I was watching The Agency, which is a kind of spy remake, French The Bureau, and it has a Ukrainian line through it, which is really positive. And there are films, there's On Fire, the amazing documentary on Netflix they put for free on YouTube, but these are few and far between. How can you help Ukraine that on social media, on popular media, and then hopefully that feeds into its interest in the higher culture?
Yeah, good question. There is currently a new film by Katerina Hornostai that is in the main competition in Berlinale. And it's about...
She's my teacher.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, she's very, very talented. And it's about Ukrainian schools during the full-scale invasion. It's a documentary again. And for me, it's a miracle that we currently have this generation of Ukrainian filmmakers, for example, who are constantly competing in the film festivals of A class, right? Cannes, Berlinale, they're getting Oscars, considering that there has been this huge gap in institutional development of Ukrainian film industry. It was basically erased during the Soviet period. There were rare stars that were allowed to film and to do something, and they were repressed. And after the independence, there was like basically no funding to do this work. But now we have a generation of filmmakers who are doing this amazing work against all odds. I don't know how they do it, how we constantly manage to resurface after each erasure, but this is definitely happening. And I guess the main advice is to pay attention to these people who are doing it without the institutional support, but doing it quite successfully, I think. So yeah, let's all stand behind Hornostai and hope she wins this Berlinale, and we all learn a bit about Ukrainian school kids and their teachers during this full-scale invasion.
Won a Berlinale. It was actually interesting. It was a fiction movie about also school kids, and I think that it was one of the last movies that was released before the beginning of the full-scale war. It was basically about this moment when kids graduate from school and then they make this choice. But it's teenagers, it's very tender, it's very, very, very kind. And it's I don't know, kind of symbolic that she continues into this documentary as well.
I'm super interested in the representations of childhood in Ukrainian culture, because like obviously what else speaks future other than childhood and children and teenagers and young adults, and there is just so much being produced currently on this subject. All the films you see in cinema that are made by Ukrainian filmmakers, they in one way or another are reflections on growing up in childhood, or like reflections on these people's growing up in the 90s and so on. So I think that Ukrainians have this, you know, future-driven vision of themselves and of their culture against the odds, which is very interesting and very specific for this particular culture.
Do you think the international community, and sorry, I'm taking up too much time, do you think the international community, there's a chance to allow Ukrainian culture to flourish, because there's going to be a reluctance to embrace Russian media, films and documentaries internationally, but actually hopefully still a desire to support Ukrainian culture abroad? I don't know.
You make me smile, it's so optimistic. If there is a reluctance to embrace Russian cultural production, I will be overjoyed, but I don't think we are like in that beautiful moment in time. I think that Ukrainians will need to fight for attention and for a spot in the lineup of international film festivals and museums programming and so on. But our job is just to make sure that this competition is fair, you know, and if there is a quality product emerging from Ukraine, that we give it a fair chance of getting attention and getting to the public.
Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of naivety around. Just in Oxford, before we left, there was a play being put on by one assumes the child of a wealthy Russian, and it was about a Russian boy and a Ukrainian girl from Mariupol, or they meet, and it's just sickening, stomach-churningly awful nonsense. But it gets funded, it gets put on.
Alone, please. Just don't.
I think it's also like a sort of a search for an easy solution. It's like related to the question of this war fatigue or whatever they call. We just don't want war, so let's just like come all together. Let's make love between a Russian boy, Ukrainian girl, and everything's.
It's always Russian boy and Ukrainian girl, right? There is
a certain power dynamic
in this couple.
A very interesting thing with patriarchal like influence and so on. So it's. Yeah.
That's already quite a patriarchal imperialist kind of angle right there, isn't it?
It's never the other way around, not that it would make us happy, you know.
Yeah. Mark?
I do like, so I'm a simple mind, I'm not academic, I look at things through a different lens.
I'm not an academic anymore either, so it's fine.
But so I look at things very simply in my mind. And I think you said very early on, Bronstein, everyone was saying that the war would be over in some 2 hours, and no one believed you when you said you would survive because you would resist, because you were Ukrainian, and no one. And I think that's pretty much. So I think it's very clear from you were going to resist. people in the streets were making petrol bombs. The will to fill was absolutely there. I think in the West, it was not that we thought you would capitulate. It was more that we thought the Russians over what the strength would be. So we thought that they would be so strong, as we have for years, decades, since the end of the Cold War. Before the end of the war, we've always had the Russian bear will come over and do it. So I think it's more from the West that it was the strength of Russians would just be overwhelming. In the army, we were in the British Army of the Rhine. The days where we were there in Germany just to die to slow them down. And I think that mentality still exists, and that fear of Russia still exists. I think it's to accept that that's probably more likely that we didn't trust you as Ukrainians to stand up for yourselves, and that it's something that we absolutely cannot ever do again.
It's not that not you, but it's not that some commentators didn't trust Ukrainians because we were Ukrainians. It's just because they didn't know anything about us. They did know a lot about Russia, and that Russia is this might and the military superpower, and that it takes so much space on the map of the continent and so on. And they didn't know anything about Ukraine because Ukraine previously had not been given the time and the attention to explain who we were and how we saw ourselves and how we saw this resistance. So it's more about that. It's not that people were prejudiced towards us because we were Ukrainians, just because they just were not interested. There is this Russia with its culture and its size and its might, and all the attention are on these factors and not on the country that is being invaded. And it's not that Russia didn't go here full force. They did. They just were stopped by people who were not afraid to fight against the superseding power, right? Because they know what they were fighting for. And I think that this aspect was underestimated. Maybe on day 4, people started tracking, okay, something is going on here, something we didn't expect.
And I think just sort of building on that, say, how will Ukrainians, and can you even reconcile if as part of the peace, the lines are not withdrawn at 1991 borders, but that they actually stand, and that would legitimise once again that it's okay to invade another country. Would you? It sounds like from what you're saying, you think there can never be that negotiated ceasefire without the Ukrainian victory. Is that from what I picked up from what you were saying?
I'm thankfully not the one whose hand has been forced to sign some kind of paper on ceasefire. Again, I'll tell a story why I think the talk of ceding territories is unfathomable for Ukrainians. So, I was in Dnipro on this exhibition opening about the resistance and occupation, and there I talked to a woman from Berdyansk who organized the protest there when Russia invaded. You all saw them, people gathering in public squares and, stopping tanks without any weapons and so on. And she was the galvanizing force behind this. And obviously she was brought to a basement, and obviously she was tortured. And she escaped, and all she thinks about is about her home and people she had to leave behind. And I also talked to a girl who is very young, and she lived her entire life in occupation, her entire conscious life, right? She's very young, in occupation in Donetsk, where she taught herself the Ukrainian language, and she speaks Ukrainian better than I do. And she now studies in Dnipro, but her family is back in Donetsk, and they are Ukrainian patriots, and they are waiting. And they're waiting for Ukrainian army to return and liberate Donetsk. And I talked to an academic who was in Kherson during the Russian occupation, and he was just absolutely fiercely documenting all the Russian propaganda posters, like he's a historian, he knows what he's doing, just going around the city and taking pictures, and he could have ended up in a basement so many times, but luckily he's all right. But he lives in Kherson, where Russian drones are hunting civilian vehicles and basically shooting at cars and trams and so on. And I'm thinking about these people who are left in the occupied territories and who live in absolutely impossible conditions, and the only thing that they have is the trust that the world will come to senses and just not leave them there to rot. Because occupation is not peace. Occupation is the continuation of war, just by different means. And I don't think that it's fathomable to just leave them there and to legitimize this kind of violation of international law again. Because it will not make us safer. It will not make the world a safer place if we do that.
I think we've probably got time for one more.
Sorry, I'm talking
before
too much.
Sasha has to rush off.
I've got one more from else.
Okay,
sorry.
Go for it.
I actually got two more, but I'll ask and the answer. JP, brought up the fact that the Germans after the war went through that reconciliation. The Japanese didn't, interestingly, because it's a different culture. But for them, the loss of the war was very much a humiliation. And Germany say so. I would debate whether they were forced to. They went through it, absolutely, and that's right. But my point is, do you think the Russians lost in Afghanistan? They could have gone through that reconciliation. They lost in the First War. We could have gone through that. They haven't, and they continue to go exactly as they have done for generations, for centuries. Do you honestly believe they're capable of going through that reconciliation, even if they are totally defeated?
The chances are higher if they are totally defeated than if they are not.
Of course, Austria didn't go through that same
And look how
deep
they're fighting
education
now.
process.
I think the latest election wasn't a great democratic success. Sorry, I shouldn't be talking about Austrian matters. Anyway.
But that's a really salient point, because actually they appear to be on the verge of writing history and with people who is a very strong of previous Austrian leaders, and so there are problems around the world at the moment. We are in such an incredibly volatile time in history, and certain elections take place where you're thinking the world's not going in the right direction. Sorry, this is a bit of a kind of a rant here, but I'm worried that Ukraine is looking to do this vision of a future for Ukraine that is democracy and transparency, all these ideals that are antithetical to Russia. And you might have argued that they would be striving for, say, the beacon of American liberty. And then you look over there and you look at the backsliding. Okay, EU. And then you look at parts of the EU with Slovakia and Hungary and Austria and the AfD and there's democratic backsliding. So it's almost like Ukraine is its own beacon at the moment. I don't know.
In a way, yes. When I feel very grim and desperate and I like what's going on in the world, I usually talk to my friends who are fighting, and they always manage to cheer me up a little bit. So I guess that the closer you are to an existential danger, the less time and resources you have to spare on despair, basically. So yeah, not that I wish it on anyone, but we just keep on going.
That's incredibly moving. Sasha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for the brilliant questions.
Thank you really for bearing with me for so long.
Pleasure. Pleasure, not a pain.
Yeah.